and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who would like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you. Hello, I'm Helen Leathers, and with me today is my co-host and business partner, Tom Dillon. Hi Tom, how are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes, on fine form. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good. Now, on our last episode, we said that we were going to talk about whether it was ever okay to ask a closed question. But today we're going to think about that, but we're also going to explore more around questions and expand out a little bit from there, aren't we? So let's get started.
It's very exciting.
It is. Let's get started with exactly the question we left off last time. Tom, is it ever okay to ask a closed question?
No. My answer hasn't changed since last time, which is good. I haven't changed my mind on this. And I think in giving my answer, therein lies the problem, that if you ask a closed question, there is a good chance you're just going to get a yes or no answer. And my definition of a closed question is that it is a question that you could just answer yes or no to. You might not, but you could. I did have a conversation with my supervisor recently about what a closed question was. And he said, my definition is that it's a question that you can provide a one-word answer to, which to me is not. No, I think if we asked someone, who were you with when this happened, they could just give you a one-word answer. But that's a clarifying question, not a closed question. So I think it is that. Let's stick with that definition of a closed question being one that you could answer yes or no to.
Okay. And I know that when you're working with new coaches on your training courses, they're learning often for the first time about coaching skills, and you're pretty adamant that they only ask open questions. Why is that?
Because it's very difficult to embed that thought in your head. We're so used to asking closed questions in our everyday conversations. We never stop to think, is that a closed question? Or is that resulting in them just shutting down? The problem is, if we ask a closed question, there is a good chance that it will shut down the person's thinking and also shut down the conversation. So we want to, within a coaching session, give our coachee the best chance of giving an expansive answer and expanding on their own thinking. I heard a lovely phrase the other day about asking questions, and the idea of breaking the word question down into its component parts. I mean, they're stretching it a little bit, but it was quite nice. So they were saying that if we take quest, the coachee is on a quest. They're trying to find something out for themselves. They're exploring their world. That might not be a solution they're looking for, but they're looking to expand their thinking. So they're on a quest. The word I is in there, and when we think of I, that's the coachee. They're the I in this statement. And the word on is in there. So it's the quest that the coachee is on. That's what we're trying to get to. That's what we're trying to work towards.
I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the coachee is trying to answer something within themselves. It might be a change that they want. It might be a desired outcome. It might just be a new perspective. And we are there as the coach to support them in that quest in the best way possible. And I think when we ask open questions, we expand their thinking, we expand their awareness. If we start to ask closed questions, then we shut that down.
Now, I remember having conversations with you about this always. And at first I thought that you were being really, really pedantic about this topic. And then I was on an online training, and we were put into breakout rooms to have conversations with some of the other people on the call. And I was working with a young man, about 18 or 19. He had some great ideas. And when we went back into the main room, the person running the training asked him some questions and then said to him, "Is there anything else?" And he simply said, "No." And I knew he had so much more to give to that conversation because we'd been talking about it in the breakout room, and he simply stopped. He stopped thinking. He had the out, really. He had the excuse to finish there. And in that moment, I realised, you'll be pleased to know that I think you're right.
Oh, thank you. That's good to know. And interestingly, that question, is there anything else, does form part of a set of questions that are used in clean language, which is a particular approach to coaching. It's all around metaphor and exploring the coachee's inner world. It's using their language But there's that odd question that sits in with a lot of really good open questions, sort of what shape is that? What colour is that? And then they ask the question, and it's part of a script of questions, is there anything else about that? And I've never understood why that exists within that framework as a question. And we held a conference, well, maybe 4 years ago now, and we invited a clean language expert along to talk about clean language. And I asked him that question, well, for what reason does that closed question exist in amongst all those open questions? And he said, well, we ask, is there anything else? Because we don't want to put pressure on the person in front of us if there isn't anything else. Now, I don't think that, like you say, gives them a way out. We're not trying to put pressure on them, but we want to expand their thinking. So why would we ask them a question that allows them just to shut down and stop thinking? So he's an expert in clean language, and who am I? But at the same time, I do think that we have to have the right intention when we're in the coaching room. And if our intention is to explore the thinking of the coachee and to expand on that coaching, to support them on their quest, then we have to have that intention of asking the best question that's going to support them. Now, if we have the intention of asking a closed question for a particular reason, I have no idea what that reason might be. So if you have a reason, feel free to let me know, and I'm happy to listen. I'm happy to have my mind changed. Although I'm not sure that I am. No, I am. No, if you can convince me. But I don't think people necessarily have the intention of asking closed questions when they do it. They're not really, they've kind of shut their thinking down, and it's sort of a bit of a lazy question. Or they intend to ask an open question, but it just somehow comes out as a closed question. So quite often I'll hear our training coaches at the beginning where they say, they're trying to ask an open question, and they say, can you think of a time when this happened? Which is a closed question, because they could go, no. Now, there's a good chance they might say, oh, yes, I can think of a specific time. But there is that potential for them to say no. So I don't think in that moment the coach is trying to ask a closed question. It's just coming out wrong.
Yeah. So do you think that if in the flow of that coaching conversation we do ask a closed question by accident, does it impact that flow? It might shut down the thinking. Does it always?
No, I think it's perfectly possible that someone will just say, oh, yes, or yeah, I'll expand on that. And they'll just carry on. That could be a thing, but why take that risk? So on our transformational coaching diploma training, we are pretty insistent that people ask open questions, or at least try to ask open questions. And when they're receiving their feedback, we tend to work in trios, so they will receive feedback from the people they're working with. Those observers will pick up on closed questions that are asked, just to let them know they're doing it, because quite often they won't even know. They thought, oh, I thought I asked a closed question there. So no, it's really good to embed that skill of asking good, crisp, open questions. We have 6 months to train people. So by the time they're finished, they can run a coaching conversation without asking closed questions. And that's where we want to get to. If at some point in the future they choose to ask a closed question, they have that intention of asking a closed question, so be it. But I would like to know that by the end of their training, they could have a coaching conversation that doesn't involve closed questions.
So going in with that intention of always asking an open question, it can be hard, as you say. In general life, we often fall into closed questions. So what would be your big tip to help ensure new and old coaches alike keep their questions open?
Well, to use Rudyard Kipling's 6 honest serving men, I think, but if we use 6 wise friends, the what, where, how, why, when, who, 6. So those 6 words, I think if you use any of those, you're going to ask an open question. If you start your question with a verb, a doing word, it's like can you, will you, could you, have you, it's going to be a closed question. And that's quite often what people do. I think it's an open question, but it will start with a verb. So that's a good way to think about it. And of those 6 words, I think the most useful are how and what. So if we want to clarify when something happened or who they were with when something happened, we will just naturally ask who, when, where. They will just come out of our mouth anyway, and we're not in danger of asking a closed question. But if we want to know more, if we ask how and what, and start each word with each question with that word, one of those words, then I think all will be well. And we had a conference a few weeks ago, and one of the delegates at the conference was showing me her notebook. And in the front of her notebook, she'd got a couple of post-it notes, one with what written on it and one with how written on it. And see, this is what I have in front of me when I'm coaching. And it just gave her that reminder that those are good words to start coaching questions with.
Excellent. So maybe a couple of post-it notes above your computer or on a notice board somewhere in your workspace, just to remind you, start your questions with these.
Yeah.
Excellent. So what and how? Why not why?
Again, I think it's the intention that you have. We're back to intention. Within the coaching space, we want the coachee to feel relaxed. We don't want them to feel as if they are being judged. And I think there is a danger that if we ask a why question, it takes them back to conversations with their parents, with teachers, with bosses who ask, well, why did you do that? In a very judgmental way. So most of us have that relationship with why questions when it's about us. So if it's about something we've done or something we're about to do, being asked why will perhaps make us a little bit defensive. And that's not good for expanding our thinking to thinking creatively, for us to feel like we have to shut ourselves down. So I think in asking the question that gets to the why, we might be a little bit more creative and ask a question that begins with what or how. So for what purpose are you thinking of doing that? Is a different way of asking a why question that is probably not going to make them feel defensive. It's an odd question anyway. It's a coaching question. It's a strange question to ask. And it stops and makes people think, and they will come up with an answer without feeling defensive. That's my experience. And I think my experience over time with asking why questions has demonstrated that people do get a little bit defensive. Or again, we run that risk of them getting defensive.
Or breaking rapport, because suddenly they see you as that critical parent or someone telling them off almost as in a teacher role. And of course, that's not the role that we have as coaches. So there's a danger there that we could break rapport, isn't there? Yeah,
absolutely. And whilst someone coming to coaching might see you as the expert in coaching, they're not seeing you as the expert in their life. We're having an adult-to-adult conversation. We're on an equal footing. So the moment they start to feel that we're being judgmental, it does change that dynamic. So I had a friend of mine that is a very well qualified and experienced coach, and he lectures on coaching, who was talking to me about this and saying that it's nonsense, this thing about why questions being defensive. It's a myth, and there's no real evidence of that. And I'm not sure that there is real evidence. Researched evidence is difficult to gain that anyway, but from my experience, I know that happens if you ask a why question. So again, why would you risk it? So I think my thinking has become more nuanced. So I think if you are asking the coachee a question about a circumstance, so maybe an inanimate object, maybe a third party, maybe a situation, you might ask, so why do you think that happened? Or why do you think they did that? Or why do you think that's a thing? Then I don't think anyone's going to get defensive about that. But if we ask it about them personally, it's individual to them, then I think there is a chance that they can be.
So much like closed questions, why risk it?
Why risk it? Yeah.
There's better questions.
You might well get away with it, but why risk it? And actually what we're looking to do, and certainly within our training, what we're looking to is to embed good practice, good skills, so that people can choose when and where, if they want to change it. It's a bit like learning to play the piano and then playing it badly for fun, just playing the wrong, just for a bit of fun. So I think if we can learn to do it well, then we can mix it up a bit if we really want to, but I'm not sure under what circumstances you would do that.
Okay. So we've talked about open versus closed questions. We've talked about the why question. What else is there about questions that you'd like to share with us today?
So a couple of other things. I think multiple questions is something that I often see, again, quite experienced coaches asking. Rather than just asking one crisp open question, they'll ask a question, then they'll do a little bit of playing back, and then they'll ask another question. So they say, so what do you think about this? Because you said earlier that this was a thing, and now, so what are you thinking now? So rather than sandwiching that statement with a couple of questions either end, just ask one crisp open question and let the other person answer. This is something you quite often see with or hear with radio interviews. If you listen to the Today programme, quite often the interviewer, I don't know whether they're just bigging up their part so they get more words in, but they will quite often ask a number of questions, and the interviewee at the end is kind of left thinking, well, which question do I ask? Because you've asked a number of different ones there. So we just want to keep it simple. Just ask one crisp open question and just let them answer it. If they've not understood the question, and I think that's quite often why people ask a second question, because they don't have the confidence in the coachee that they will understand the question. So they try to rephrase it before the person has a chance to answer it. But most people will understand what you're asking. And if they don't, they might stop and say, I'm not sure I understood that question. Or they'll answer a question in a way you hadn't intended, and you might want to then ask another question just to go back to your original point. But actually, their answer might well take you in a different direction anyway.
So giving the coachee space to think about the question and allowing them that space to think, as is good coaching practice, and not immediately assuming that silence means they haven't understood the question and I need to rephrase it. That's a really good place to start from. And making sure we just ask one question at a time.
Yes, because the silence is the space in which they do their really good thinking. So we want to allow for that silence. Good. It's the only thing that I have to say about questions today is about leading questions. And this is where the coach has perhaps had a thought. They've had some insights that they want to share, but they want to ask good open questions. And they
don't want to be directive.
But somehow it still comes out in their question what their thought was, and they start to lead the coachee in the direction that they wanted to go. So if let's imagine that someone wanted to lose weight, and a coach had a thought, oh, I know what the answer is here, and they want to share that, but they don't want to be directive. They might say, have you thought of trying Weight Watchers? Now, that's a closed question, obviously, so they don't want to do it, but it's also their thought. Now, they might ask that question in a more open way, so they might have had a thought and say, what do you think would happen if you tried calorie counting? So again, they're getting in their bit of advice. Oh, calorie counting is a great idea. Try that. They're getting that in by asking an open question, but it's a leading question. And again, we want to avoid that because we want the coachee to think for themselves. And if we give them a suggestion through a question, then they might well think, well, that's what he wants me to take away. So I'll respect that. I'll be polite. I'll take his suggestion. I won't do it, but I'll take the suggestion. And obviously that's not our intention in the coaching room. We want the coachee to generate their own thinking.
So crisp, clear, open questions that are single questions to ensure the coachee has lots of space, lots of time, lots of headspace to think and generate new thinking and new perspectives. That's what we want from a coaching session.
Yeah, and I think if we stick to that, and it's actually very simple once you get the hang of it. It takes a bit of practice to start with, but once you have it in your head, and we've given a few tips as to how people might do that, but once it's there, then I think you're going to have much better coaching conversations. And I very rarely ask a closed question these days. Occasionally, I just get caught up in the story, in the conversation, and I just forget that I'm coaching, and I'm just, ooh, and suddenly a closed question comes out, but very few and far between these days.
And something I think for our listeners to contemplate is to really think about the questions that they ask going forward and really consider, is there an open question here?
Or maybe consider, what is the open question that lies behind that closed question?
Great choice of question to ask yourself. What is the open question that lies behind that closed question? So a bit of a challenge to new coaches and old coaches alike.
Yeah, so it's not restricted to new coaches. I see some very experienced coaches that do webinars and demo sessions and get caught up in asking closed questions that I'm not sure what their intention is. So it's not restricted to new coaches. And I think it's back to that intention. If you want to have a good productive coaching session where people do new generative thinking, then that's where we want to be.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your thoughts on our questions, Tom.
Thank you.
Next time on the podcast, we'll be looking at the solution-focused approach to coaching, which is something that we probably all do a little bit of, but we're going to explore in more detail. Tune in to find out more, and you can always subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Bye for now.
Bye-bye for now.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.